I got up early this morning and had an opportunity to listen to the news, and you don't get a lot of good news or a lot of hope spread from the news agencies these days. It's very difficult to remain happy and hopeful when you listen to the things that are going on the streets of our major cities and as you see what's happening in our country as a whole. And yet the Bible tells us that our God is aware of everything that's happening and that He is a wonderful God, that He is, as the psalmist said, and I want to read that to you from Psalm 145, beginning at verse 8 and going through verse 9. The Lord is gracious and compassionate, slow to anger, and rich in love. The Lord is good to all. He has compassion on all He has made. And sometimes it doesn't seem so obvious that God is being compassionate toward us and helping us out. Life is full of problems, and we're fighting the virus right now that's changed our lifestyle and made it more difficult for us to have a reason to rejoice every morning. But if we really look back into the history of mankind and see how God has been a major player in everything that's ever happened, then we can understand how the writer of the Psalms could say, in spite of the fact that he had his conflict with Goliath and he had to be a warrior and fight for Israel, that God is compassionate, He is generous, and He is gracious. He's always aware of our needs, and He meets those needs. Maybe not when we want to, the way we want to, but He is always at our side. And if we forget that, we lose hope, we lose happiness, we lose the joy of everyday living. And I hope that we can all hang on to that tightly as we face the world going through a great storm right now. I think that if we just look back at biblical history, we can appreciate what God has done and is doing today. I think about the very creation. I think about the time when God formed all of the heavenly beings and then put mankind here as his crowning creation and put man in charge of all the things that He had made. But man was a weak creature. We see it from the very beginning. God tells us this in Psalm 103, that He made man from the dust of the earth. And that's where Adam came from. And you can't expect a whole lot out of something that's made out of dirt. And so Adam was created by God from the dust of the earth. And yet at the same time, when the job was done, we read that in Psalm 139, that man was wonderfully made, fearfully made, that he is as I said, a crowning creation of all of God's labors. And so Adam was created and put into the Garden of Eden. Why in the Garden of Eden? Well, the Bible says that God is a compassionate God. And so when He created man, He put him in a beautiful place to live. We don't know the exact location today, but we do know that 4 great rivers flowed out of the garden. And 2 of them, the Tigris and the Euphrates, are known to man today. And it was a place that was supposed to be and was a lovely, lovely garden. That's why Eden, translated properly, means paradise. So He put him in paradise and let him have everything that he wanted and gave him everything that he needed. And so Adam had a God that was watching over his every move, making sure that he was safe and that he had what was necessary for a peaceful life and a happy life. But God recognized in Genesis chapter 2 that there was something that was missing. And He realized, oh, he's alone. He needs somebody else. And so He created for him a helpmeet, the King James Version says, someone suitable to be his aid in everything that he did. And that's where We read about Eve being made from the rib that God took out of Adam's body and became his helpmeet. But just like Adam wasn't perfect, neither was she, and she was tempted by Satan, fell, as we know, Genesis chapter 3, and God was compelled, since he had told them that if they ate of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil that was found in the midst of the garden, which they should not touch or eat, that they would die. And they began to die from that moment they did that. And it was Satan who came in the form of a serpent and persuaded and Eve to do that, and as a result, we find that they fell from grace and began to have to struggle in the same world we're living in right now, because we're told that the thorns and thistles would be their enemies, and as they tried to produce their own food, and that they would work by the sweat of their brow. So paradise was lost, as so many pieces of literature and poetry have mentioned. But God still was concerned about them. When he said you will die, didn't mean that you will disintegrate, that you will disappear, that you won't exist anymore. And so Adam and Eve continued living on. As a matter of fact, the Hebrew, when properly translated, would be dying you shall die. And so the process of death began from the time they touched the fruit and ate the fruit. And they were going to die. And yet God cast them out of paradise. But where did he put them? In the world that we're living in today. And I'm deliberately sitting on my back porch today so you can see all the vegetation around me. I've got grapevines here that are bearing grapes right now. Out in the yard, I've got apple trees and peaches and other plums that are growing. And, it's not such a bad world. It's a beautiful world. As a matter of fact, if you take the pictures that we get back from the moon and from Mars and from the other planets that have been photographed from satellites, there's not much out there. Matter of fact, they keep asking the question, is there water on these planets? Is there life there somewhere? And the reason is because there isn't. And I've been told, and trust that those who study the universe, that there are 2 trillion in our universe, 2 trillion galaxies. That's just unfathomable. I can't get my head around that at all. I've tried and I just can't. But in all of those different planetary bodies and solar systems in our entire universe and all of the galaxies, we're told that they're probably not enough to be able to provide in any one place all of the things necessary for life, and especially for a human life. Consequently, those who think that every planet has life somewhere hidden in a cave are mistaken. This is probably the only planet that has any life, and especially human life, in existence. So, why? If you can just imagine our planet as green and beautiful as it is, and you see how large the universe is, and you talk about millions of light years of travel to go to some of the other places that we are aware exist. Why? And it's because God loved us and gave us a world in which we could live, a wonderful world. We were wonderfully and fearfully made, but we were also given a wonderful environment. And I sometimes think about it and I think, well, they got kicked out of Eden, out of paradise, to live in this wonderful world we live in. And it could have been a lot worse. They wouldn't have lasted long on most of the planetary bodies. They wouldn't have lasted long on the satellites of those planetary bodies. And if you got anywhere near any of the stars, which are suns, you would be fried in a second. So this is not a bad deal. And God was compassionate to give Adam a place where even if he sinned and began to die, that he would be able to survive more than 5 seconds, more than 5 years, and a whole lifetime. And some men, because God decreed it to be that way, lived almost 1,000 years. And populated the world. So Adam was guilty of sin, and he paid for his sins, and he died. He's not with us any longer today, and Eve also, and their children's children have passed away, and we will pass away soon. But in the meantime, God has given us a lovely place to live, and it may not be as wonderful as the Garden of Eden was, but it's as close to a paradise as I can imagine, and I cannot imagine how wonderful heaven's going to be if it's better than the Garden of Eden, and which was a whole lot better than what we experience here every day. But God is a compassionate and generous and loving God, and He's slow to anger. He's very readily willing to forgive, and here we are enjoying His blessings, and He provides for those that He made everything that they need according to the text we just read. But then as I think about the history of the world, I know that in Genesis chapter 6, very short time after the creation, in reality, we find that man became very wicked, and every imagination of his thoughts were only evil constantly. As a result, God decided to destroy the world. But he found that Noah was a pretty decent man, Genesis 6:8, and He allowed him to live and continue on. And he was gracious, and he was wonderful to Noah, and let him know 100 years in advance that there was a flood going to be coming, and enabled him to prepare an ark and save his family, 8 people in all, and to continue on with the human race on this planet. And so just as it started with Adam and Eve, it started all over with Noah and his family. But it wasn't long after God had spared the lives of these people. And I've often wondered, what if I were the only person on the face of the earth? Would God care about me? Would God save my soul? And the answer is yes. And how do I know that? Because He did it with Noah. If I will just love Him, believe in Him, serve Him, do the best I can, in spite of my sin, God will provide what I need, and life will go on this planet. So that's what we find in Genesis chapter 6, 7, 8, all the way down to chapter 9. But then as you move on and get down to chapter 12, you find that as the world's being repopulated, another man comes along who was called the friend of God, Abraham, and he was asked to leave the land where he lived, Ur of Chaldees, and go to the land of Canaan, which he had never heard of, never seen, had no road maps back then, no GPS, but he made the move that God wanted him to make, and God carried him to the promised land, a land that Moses later would say is a land that flows with milk and honey, a land that is going to produce more bread than you can eat, he told Moses and the Jewish people. And so with Abraham, He gave him this piece of land and said, it's yours. I'm going to give it to you and your descendants forever. And that was the plan, even though he knew that eventually they would sin, and there was going to be a plan of redemption that would change things even for the Jewish people. But Abraham was God's friend, we're told. And God would speak to him, we're told back in Exodus chapter 33, as a man speaks to his friends. When you hear people that are speaking and they don't know each other, it sounds very formal, and you know that they're probably not close friends. But when people who are close friends begin to speak to each other, you recognize that they seem to be familiar with one another and have a relationship. There's fellowship there, communion. And so that's the kind of communication that Abraham had with God. And God gave him what he needed and protected him even from his enemies. And so he was given not a Garden of Eden. He was still here on earth, but he had a wonderful, wonderful place to dwell. And then eventually Lot took some of that from him because their shepherds were his shepherds with Abraham's shepherds were fighting. And so anyway, they split company, and Lot went down to Sodom and Gomorrah. But he continued to be Abraham's nephew and still was in favor with God. But we know the history of Sodom and Gomorrah and the homosexuality and all that caused God's wrath to come against them. And so when in chapter 18 of Genesis, God is planning on destroying Sodom and Gomorrah, and the other cities that were in that valley, there were 5 in all. He thought about Abraham, and he thought, well, am I going to destroy these people without letting Abraham know about it? And I'm sure he was taking into consideration that Lot and his wife and 2 daughters were down there along with the husbands of those 2 daughters. And he thought, I can't really just destroy this place without letting my friend Abraham know about it. And so he told him that he was going to destroy those cities. That the cry had come up of all of their wickedness and that he was going to wipe them out. But of course, that means that he possibly could kill Lot and his family as well. So he tells Abraham, and then Abraham asks, are you going to kill the righteous with the unrighteous? And begins to bargain with God. And you think people are friends. Let me tell you, when a man can bargain with God, they are very close to him. And so Abraham said, would you kill all the people down there if there were 50 people that were righteous? And God said, no, I'll take that in consideration. I won't. And well, what if they're just, 40, 30, 20? Finally got down to 10 people. And God said, if there are 10 righteous people, I won't destroy the city. Well, or cities. And in reality, the moment came when God realized, and Abraham didn't know it, but it was true that there were not even 10 righteous people there. But God enabled Lot to leave, warned him. Angelic visitors led him out of the harm's way to a little town called Zoar, where he was not put to death. His wife was told, along with him, not to look back on the city. Once you leave Sodom and Gomorrah, don't look back. And she did, and just as God had mentioned before, she was immediately converted into a pillar of salt. She died. She paid for her sin because she deliberately, in the very most critical moment, turned back and looked. But we find that Abraham continued to be prospered by God, and his descendants continued in the promised land, as it's called, in the Holy Land, as it later came to be known. And God showed that he was, as we've read, gracious, that he was compassionate, and that he did all that he could to bless those that were his with a good life and good environment. That happened to all of the people in the scriptures that turned to God in spite of their sins, in spite of their wickedness. When they asked God for forgiveness, he was slow to anger and quick to love and to forgive. And that's why we know that we have a God that is a special God, a compassionate God, and why he loves us so much. And I wish, I really do, that we all could recognize that God has been gracious to all of his people throughout the centuries that have gone by, and that we're living, as I am trying to portray right here today in this garden area in which I'm dwelling, that God gives us what we need. And if you were to be one of the ones that was given the opportunity to go to Mars, and that is something that's slated to happen in the future, then you wouldn't find it as easy to live there as we find it here. We have everything we need. When I came into this world, I had no knowledge of it and began to learn and experience. And the birds that I have seen, the butterflies, as the world is painted with so much color, and the temperatures may freeze in the winter and get hot here in the summer. But as you look at all of those things, we're blessed. Oh my, are we blessed. And God has given us not a Garden of Eden, perhaps. It sure seems like one to me. But he has given us a life that is worth living. And he does still make us pay that penalty of death. Hebrews 9:27. From the time of Adam and Eve, death has been assigned as the destiny of all human beings. But I feel like David when I look at the stars and the moon, I look at the heavens and I see that God's glory is there. Psalm 19 verse 1. And I see that God is conscious of us and our needs, according to Psalm 8. verse 1 through 4. And as we look at these scriptures, we realize they're being fulfilled in our life, in our very existence here on earth. But just as we are promised that God will be with the faithful and God will be with those that love and serve Him, we also are going to face the day when we leave this world. But when we leave it, and this is another lesson I'll be bringing to you soon, we're promised that we're going to go someplace that's better than the Garden of Eden. We haven't seen the Garden of Eden. We don't know how wonderful it was, but we know it was good. And we're told that God is so compassionate, so forgiving, so loving, and so concerned about humanity as a whole that we can expect something that's coming that's going to be better than what Adam and Eve had before they sinned in the garden. Can't imagine it. You can't either. It's impossible to do that. But as I look at the universe as a whole, and I look at the place I live, and the things that God has done for me and my family and those around me, and all of the righteous that I know, people that are good people, I know that heaven has got to be wonderful. I have a mansion over the hilltop, the song says, that's waiting for me. And do I deserve it? Oh, believe me, I know I don't. Neither do you. But it'll be given to us. But why would God give something so wonderful to us? For the same reason they took a pile of dirt, turned it into a human being, and gave him the Garden of Eden. For the same reason that he gave him a wife. For the same reason that he had Abraham as a friend. All of these things that the Bible teaches us show that God is a compassionate God, and that we're so blessed to have a Father in heaven, as Jesus referred to him, who cares about us, conscious of us. And Jesus said in Matthew chapter 10:29, a sparrow cannot fall to the ground and die, that God is not aware of it. And he says, sparrows aren't very expensive. Back in his day, you could buy 2 for a penny. And he said, and yet God is aware of their needs. God is aware of what happens to them. And he knows how many hairs are on our head in that same context. And he says that we're worth a lot more than a basketful, he didn't use that term, but it's true, of sparrows. And God knows how much he cares about us, and he takes care of us because he is compassionate, generous, gracious, forgiving, kind. Oh, we are just so blessed, and I am very thankful to be able to come to you today, a Lord's Day, and in this wonderful environment. I hope, I'm recording this the day before, I'm hoping it'll be a beautiful day tomorrow as well, and that you'll be able to see the glory of God in his creation and know that all of this was placed here so that we wouldn't be living on the moon. And you've seen those moonscapes, they're not very pretty. You never thought, oh, I'd love to build a house over there on that hilltop. No, not on the moon. The moon's pretty from here because, hey, we're where God wanted us to be. And he put the moon up there so we could see it and the stars. And for that reason, we know that he loves us. But I wouldn't want to live on them. I'm happy to live right where I live. And it may not be the Garden of Eden, but it's good enough for now until I can go and be with God. But I'm promised that there is something better yet to come. How compassionate can we hope God would be? Not any more than what he is. May God be compassionate, generous, loving, and kind to you all the days of your life. And may you always search for him, love him, and serve him. If you'd like to talk to me more about this, call me at 303-229-9444. And we'll have an hour or two long chat about how wonderful our God is. God bless you today. Love you and enjoyed being with you.